Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This is PA Books, featuring authors of books about Pennsylvania's people, politics, history, and business. This week, David McCullough discusses his book, 1776.
David McCullough, author of 1776, if there was some moment, some scene in your book that you would desperately have loved to have witnessed, what is that?
Just one?
You can pick a couple of them.
One. Well, I would love to have been on board one of the British ships in the harbor at Boston. The morning they woke up and looked out and saw that the guns from Ticonderoga had been put overnight on top of Dorchester Heights. And what amazement, consternation, anger, bewilderment, and sense of we better get out of here fast that permeated on those ships. But maybe most of all, I'd love to have been on the East River on the Brooklyn side the night that Washington and the Army escaped from Brooklyn after the disastrous defeat in the Battle of Long Island. It was the Dunkirk of the Revolutionary War, and there was so much going on. It was such an incredible feat with nature and raw courage and ability, all combining to make possible the survival of the Army and Washington, and I think the Revolution. If things had gone differently that night, I think it would have been over. If the wind had been out of a different direction, if the river had been too rough to cross, if the British had found out what was afoot and descended on the Army with all of their power and numbers. It's like something out of a fable or legendary miraculous event from far, far back in time. But it really happened with the wind changing exactly when it was needed, when a providential fog set in and protected the remainder of the Army that hadn't gotten off yet as daylight was coming. And then the extraordinary performance of John Glover and his Marblehead fishermen, his unit from Massachusetts, who manned all the boats that they just rounded up overnight, grabbing them wherever they could from along the shores of the Hudson and the East River in New Jersey.
Now, for people who are not familiar with that setting, what was Washington's Army doing there, and why did they have to escape?
Well, the British had sent across from Britain and from elsewhere all together an armada of altogether 400 ships. There'd never been anything like it. It was the greatest military force ever sent across the waters to conquer a distant foe. Nobody in the 18th century, not even the British themselves, had ever seen such an armada. And the spectacle of those ships sailing into New York Harbor is one I would give a very great deal to have seen. They landed 32,000 troops on Staten Island, and 32,000 troops was an army larger than the entire population of Philadelphia at the time, which was then the largest city in the country. So it was a massive force, and they then proceeded to land on Long Island, and Washington divided his army against a superior foe, which is a mistake you don't make, and sent half of them over to Brooklyn to try and hold Brooklyn against the British. And what resulted was the Battle of Brooklyn, in which Washington and the Army were outflanked, outsmarted, outfought, outnumbered, and they were trapped on what is now Brooklyn Heights. And there was no no way to escape except back across the East River. And if the wind had not been out of the northeast, it would have been very easy for the British to have brought 2 or 3 of their warships up into the river, and there would have been no escape for Washington and his army. But they decided in the middle of the night of August 29th, that they better make a try to get across, get back. And it was incredible. An organized retreat by an experienced army, when faced with an overwhelming opposition, is the hardest of all military maneuvers. And here was a ragtag army of amateurs, truly farm boys from Connecticut and elsewhere who had no experience at all. They're about as green as troops could be. And they brought it off. They did it. And the British never caught on. When they went down to the river to try to cross, the water was so rough they couldn't get across. So the same favorable wind, favorable to their benefit, was also a handicap in that they couldn't get boats across. And all of a sudden, the wind stopped. The wind dropped. It wasn't exactly the parting of the Red Sea, but it was pretty close to it, and they could take the boats across. But because they were delayed at first, because of the adverse currents and rough water, they were late getting everybody across, and it was starting to get light, and they still had a lot of the army to evacuate. And if the daylight came up and the British saw this, then they would have pulverized the remaining men on the beach, so to speak. But at that point, in comes a providential fog, so thick you couldn't see 6 feet ahead of you, and yet there was no fog at all over on the New York side. Now, if you wrote that in a novel, your editor would say, no, things like this don't happen in real life. But it did happen. And they got 9,000 men, all of their equipment, cannon, horses, everything, across that river without a single loss of life. Unbelievable. And it saved the army, saved the American cause.
You said that Washington violated one of the major rules of war in dividing his army, and in the book he does that a couple of times, 2 or 3 times. Did it ever work?
No.
Never worked?
Well, no, it doesn't work.
But he kept doing it.
He kept doing it. Well, he had some cause that this time, first of all, he couldn't really defend New York. If you didn't have control of the water, we had no navy. We had no warships. Here you have this massive British Navy coming in, taking over, and you're on an island. There's not much you can do against that kind of force, that kind of power. A couple of their ships had more cannon than we'd had on the entire island to defend New York. It was a political decision, and Washington was a political general, which we ought to remember. And thank goodness he was a political general, because he never forgot who was boss, Congress. And he always deferred to Congress, again and again, sometimes when he shouldn't have bothered. Eventually, Congress turned over complete control to him. They made him a virtual dictator. And his wonderful answer is, he said, I took up the sword only because there was no other choice to defend my country. I will put it down again as soon as there's no more cause to have it. And that's exactly what he would do when the war was over. He would completely abdicate, turn back all power of his command to Congress. And that had never been done before in history. When George III got wind that Washington might do this, from Benjamin West, from Pennsylvania, the painter, who was then living in London, it was the court painter to the king. When Benjamin West told George III that Washington might do this, George III said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. And one of John Trumbull's great paintings in the rotunda of the Capitol in Washington is of Washington relinquishing his command. It's in the tradition of Cincinnatus, the Roman hero, who after commanding the conquering army, then gives up his command and returns to the plow, it returns to the farm.
When you were working on this book, and George Washington is so much of a focus of this book, did you look at it and say that he was just too good to be true?
No, because he was very much of a human being. He had failings and weaknesses. He wasn't a brilliant general. He made some brilliant moves, but he wasn't a great general in the way Napoleon was, let's say, or other commanders down and through history.
Did he study military history? I mean, how did he learn to be a general?
He fought in the French and Indian War. He learned by experience. Experience was his great teacher all through life. But when he took command of the American Army, what became known as the Continental Army, in the summer of 1775 at Boston, he was all of 43 years old. He wasn't the white-haired fellow with the awkward teeth that we're familiar seeing in paintings and on our money. He was a 43-year-old young Virginia planter who hadn't really done anything militarily for 15 years and who had never commanded an army in battle before in his life. And he had a lot to learn. And he knew that. He warned Congress that he wasn't fit for the job. He wasn't up to it. But he also knew that he was more up to it and more fit for it than anybody else they might choose. So when they did choose him, John Adams put his name in nomination before the Continental Congress in Independence Hall. He knew that he had to accept it because there was as many limitations as he had. He was more suitable for it than other people, in large part because he came from Virginia. The Army at that point was virtually all a New England Army at Boston, keeping the Redcoats, the British, penned up in Boston. Boston was under siege. But the people who voted these decisions here in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress knew that you couldn't just have a New England Army. You had to have that army be representative of all of the colonies, all of the would-be states. And so by picking a Virginian, that gave it a geographical balance. And they could not have picked a better man. They were absolutely right, as time would tell. He wasn't a great orator. He wasn't an intellectual the way Jefferson or Franklin or Adams were. But he was a leader. And he learned from experience. He knew how to spot talent or ability in his younger officers and give them their head, give them the job. He had absolute integrity, tremendous physical courage, and he would not quit. He would not give up, which may in many ways have been his most salient strength.
Why was he a rebel?
Because he believed, as most of them did, that the United States, that we Americans should run things ourselves, that we should control our own destiny, that we should elect our own representatives, that we should not be at the bidding and the dictates of the king or parliament. And once the call for independence became more pronounced, which didn't happen until 1776, and once the noble ideas and ideals of the Declaration of Independence were in currency, so to speak, he was all for it. He never lost sight of what the war was about. And it wasn't for him. He was an ambitious man, ambitious in that he wanted to make the most of himself ambitious to excel, as they said in that day. But he wasn't looking for power for himself, as he demonstrated by relinquishing power in the most dramatic and conspicuous fashion.
You have a scene in here at Kips Bay, I guess it is, in New York, where there is fighting going on, and you say, in a fury, talking about Washington, in a fury, he plunged his horse in among them, trying to stop them from fleeing. Cursed violently, he lost control of himself. By some accounts, he brandished a cocked pistol. In other accounts, he drew his sword, threatening to run men through. You also have him riding through battle with bullets flying around. Well, first of all, did you ever get the feeling he was bulletproof? And second of all, if he had been
killed in the battle, would that have been the end of the revolution, just if he himself had died?
That scene is terribly important, it seems to me, because he loses it. He's lost control of himself. His anger, his frustration, his disappointment in these troops who are being cowards. They're running in the face of the enemy. And there weren't all that many of the enemy. Was to him inexcusable, intolerable. And when he saw his own officers, not just the men, running like rabbits, and he plunges in among them and he starts using his whip and cursing and so the rest. And it must have been something to see. And he very nearly gets himself killed or captured. And I think, yes, if he had been killed or captured at Kips Bay, that would have been the end of it. Would have been over. I think that if he had been killed or captured or quit at almost any point through this year and in other years that followed, that would have been it. There really was no one to take his place. Eventually, Nathaniel Greene, who was one of the young men that he saw ability in right at the beginning, would become perhaps a better tactical, strategic general. Greene was brilliant. And Washington said that if anything ever happens to me, Greene should take charge. But Greene doesn't really emerge that way until he is sent to fight the war in the South, which comes much later. What many people don't realize is how long the Revolutionary War was. It's the longest war in our history, except for Vietnam.
How long did it run?
8.5 years. And it was bloody. It wasn't sort of a nice costume pageant with lovely 18th century people in their satin breeches and their powdered hair preening around on stage. 25,000 lives, American lives were lost. Well, 25,000 lives, proportionate to the population, was a terrible toll. There were only about 2,500,000 people in the country in 1776. If we were in a war today, if we were fighting a revolution today, and the losses were comparable, proportionately, it would be over 3 million people. So, and it wasn't, of course, just the soldiers who suffered. It was their families and loved ones at home. The diseases they spread, typhus, typhoid, epidemic dysentery, smallpox, spread through the civilian populations, too. It was a very dark time. In fact, I think, and others feel this too and have said so, 1776 was the darkest time in the history of our country. The future prospects for the United States of America never looked so bleak.
What would have made the soldiers stick around, stay with the Army? There were desertions, but some of them stayed at a time like that after they lost all the battles.
Well, a very great many didn't stay. There was a point in December when things were about as bad as they ever were, when the enlistment of 2,000 men came up, and 2,000 men marched home with no sense of a moral obligation to stay on. But some did. Like Washington, they wouldn't quit. And at one point, there were only about 3,000 men left in the whole army. 3,000 men against an army of over 30,000. And in fact, any rational person, and there were many looking at the situation, who said the war is over and we've lost. And many who said the war is over and we lost didn't quit either.
Why?
Loyalty to Washington, loyalty to their buddies, their fellow soldiers, tenacity, faith in the cause, fervent belief in what they were fighting for.
At what point did the soldiers or the generals or the citizenry start thinking of this as our nation, as opposed to the colonies or individual states? When did they start thinking of the idea?
I don't think there is any one point. You could say that it was the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but I don't think that's quite accurate. John Adams said that the American Revolution began well before any shots were fired at Lexington or Concord, because it began in the hearts of the American people, when they began to see themselves as different from Europeans, different from their English brethren back in the British Isles. I suspect that one could make a case that it began with a victory at Trenton. Not that that was a great battle in numbers or in military magnitude. It was a psychological victory, a victory for American morale. That's why it's so important. Suddenly, people who had been with the Army in spirit, or with the cause in spirit, but discouraged about there being much chance for the cause to succeed, got the idea, maybe we might win. We can beat these people. We've shown we can beat them, and maybe we might beat them again.
What happened to Trenton? How was Washington able to win?
Total surprise. He came down from the north. He'd crossed the Delaware, McConkey's Ferry.
This is the Washington's Crossing
Washington's
battle?
crossing the Delaware. Terrible night, northeaster storm, sleet, rain, snow, bitterly cold. So cold that 2 men froze to death on the march down to Trenton. They were the only American fatalities of the night, of the next day. But that's a pretty good indication of how cold it was and how poorly clothed they were. And many were, yes, truly, as legend has it, in bare feet, in the snow, in the slush. And they struck early in the morning, and the Hessians were not drunk, as some stories would have it, or hungover from celebrating Christmas the day before.
Or taken by surprise.
Well, yes, they were taken by surprise. They'd been warned that there'd be an attack, but they didn't think there'd be a big attack, and they didn't think it'd be a big attack in such foul weather. And out of this terrible storm charges an American army. It was all over very fast, and a total decisive victory. But what compounded the moral impact, or morale impact, I should say, not moral, of this victory was that instead of then turning and going right back to the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware, Washington followed up very quickly, a few days later, in the new year of 1777, the first week. He followed up with a big end run around the route around to the south and to the east, little known route, and struck at Princeton, where again he won. So it was one victory on top of the other in a very short time. Now these were, I repeat, they were small in scale, but in terms of their effect on morale, in terms of the impression it made on the enemy, the British and the Hessians, they were very large.
Did he get to be a better general as time went along?
Yes.
Or was he just lucky in those cases?
Yes.
He did.
And they had people coming in like von Steuben and Lafayette and others from Europe who improved the general tone of the officers. Washington and his best officers saw right away that what the real problem of the Continental Army is they needed better trained officers. The officers were often, nearly always, elected by the enlisted men, by the militiamen, or by the troops that had volunteered. And they had no more military skill or knowledge or experience with command than the enlisted men did. Two of my favorite characters, whose letters or diaries that I've drawn on heavily for my book, were Ipswich, Massachusetts shoemaker named Joseph Hodgkins and a Connecticut farmer named Jabez Fitch. And they were as much men in the ranks as anybody else, though they were also called lieutenants. And it's in their diaries and letters that you get a great, direct, vivid, entirely genuine feeling of what it was like to have been in their shoes, to have been through that experience. We had no idea how those men suffered, how horrendous, unrelenting the struggle was. It wasn't just they had a few bad days, or they had a few snowstorms they had to contend with. or a few long, wet, muddy, sloppy roads to march down. That's virtually all they had, week after week, month after month.
Are you able to get copies of those diaries or the originals and sit and read them?
Yes, read the originals.
Does it take you a while to adjust?
Sometimes they've been published, so it's not necessary to see the original, though when possible I like to. Sometimes the handwriting is very difficult to understand, very illegible, not just because they didn't necessarily have the best handwriting, but because they were being written under such adverse conditions. The wonder is that they took the time to write them at all. And I feel that people like Jabez Fitch and Joseph Hodgkins were doing an enormous service to their country by keeping those diaries and writing those letters in addition to fighting the war, because we have their account of what happened. Some of them also are memoirs that were written after the fact. There was a wonderful memoir by a man named John Greenwood, who signed up as a little boy, 16 years old, but he was very small for his age and looked younger, and his memoir is marvelous. Another was Joseph Plum Martin, again, a young boy, a teenager from Connecticut, who wrote another especially colorful and candid memoir. The value of these is beyond description.
Are there people in this book, characters in this book, who should be more famous than they are?
Yes, indeed. Nathaniel Greene. Everybody should know about Nathaniel Greene. Everybody should know about Henry Knox. I think that the role they played. Nathaniel Greene, for example, on the 4th day of January, from Boston, was a New Englander, a man who had no more than about a 5th grade education, formal education, but who never stopped learning, never stopped reading, who had signed up to fight in the war and was made a general at the age of 33, despite the fact that the only thing he knew about warfare and army life and military practice was what he'd read in books. And he was a Quaker. And he was a Quaker who had a severe limp left from a childhood injury. So by the standards we're accustomed to, he would have been exempt from military service. And that man was very quickly recognized by Washington as the best he had. And on January 4th, 1776, a few days after they get word that the King of England has given a speech in which he says, we're going to come and we're going to crush this rebellion because you are in rebellion and your leaders are traitors. And that signaled to us, a speech that had been given in October, but it took all that while to reach Boston, that signaled to us that it wasn't going to be a minor family squabble that would be patched up quickly, and that the king meant business, and we were in the fight for keeps. If you said, I'm for independence, or I want to declare independence, you were committing treason. And very few people said it on paper, said it in writing, in a letter they would sign. They might have talked about it, but this wasn't something you openly acknowledged or left a record of. Nathaniel Greene wrote a letter to a congressman from his state of Rhode Island, Samuel Ward, here in Philadelphia, saying it is time for a declaration of independence. This is long before people here in Philadelphia are saying that. And that is expressive, it seems to me, both of conviction, farsightedness, and courage. He meant business, this young fellow. And his letters are marvelous. His thinking is so clear. When he makes a terrible mistake, we were talking about Washington making mistakes. Greene made a horrendous mistake in thinking that Fort Washington in New York could be defended successfully, that they could hold out in Fort Washington, told Washington that, guaranteed to Washington they could hold out. Well, they didn't hold out, and it was the biggest surrender of the war. Over several thousand of American troops just surrendered, made prisoners, along with all their war materiel and cannons and the like. Terrible blow. A lesser man than George Washington would have fired Nathaniel Greene or would have blamed Nathaniel Greene for this disaster. Washington didn't blame him and didn't fire him because he knew how good Greene was. And he knew that Greene, too, like George Washington, would learn from experience. So I think that's another reason to know about Greene, because he wasn't perfect. He did make mistakes, but he overcame the mistakes, and he had the confidence of the man who was in command of him, and that, too, of course, made Greene forever as loyal to Washington as anyone could possibly be.
And Henry Knox, you mentioned?
Henry Knox, too. Henry Knox was a big, fat, garrulous Boston bookseller, 25 years old. No experience, again, like Greene, no knowledge of military matters except from what he'd read in books. But you have to remember that was an age of the Enlightenment, when people believed to their depths that there was nothing you couldn't learn by a close study of books. That books weren't a bad place to go to find out how to do things. And Knox came to Washington with this outlandish idea: why don't we send an expedition off to Fort Ticonderoga, hundreds of miles distant, upstate New York, and haul those cannon that are there back to Boston and put them up on top of Dorchester Heights, and that'll drive the British out of Boston. It was a preposterous idea. How are you going to haul all those cannon across the Berkshire Mountains in the dead of winter? What's so interesting is that the idea got from Knox, who was a nobody at that point, all the way to the commander-in-chief, Washington, within a few days. And Knox came and presented the idea to Washington himself. Washington said, I like it. You're in charge. Said, take your brother with you. Your brother was 19. These two young men set off, and they pulled it off. They did it. They hired teams of oxen and men to drive the oxen. They built giant sleds. They made the problem of winter be the solution to the problem of winter, that they would drag these sleds, these cannon, on sleds over the snow. And they hauled them over the Berkshire Mountains, more than 300 miles all the way to Boston, put the guns up on top of Dorchester Heights in one night, which was a phenomenal feat of ingenuity and determination, and organizing people into the sheer magnitude of manpower to get them up there in one night. Totally surprised the British. British wake up, see the guns on Dorchester Heights, and know they've got to go. So it isn't just that this new American way of life that's emerging offers opportunity for the individual. It offers opportunity for ideas. That kind of an idea, if born in the mind of a very junior officer, far down in the order of command in the British Army, would never have gotten to the top like that. And even if it had, probably wouldn't have been taken as seriously as it was. Because if you're all new to fighting a war, then almost anybody's idea is worth listening to, and maybe even trying. And that is an important clue to how and why eventually we triumphed. We won the war.
Can I take a minute out from this to ask you a little bit about yourself? You are a native of Pittsburgh?
I am, proudly.
How long did you live there?
Well, I was born and raised there, went to school there until I went away to college. And after I finished college, I kept going back, but I never worked there. I found my first job in New York, and I've worked in New York and Washington and other places elsewhere because of my career, because of my writing. But I'm about as ardent a Pittsburgh man as you'll ever meet. I think it's one of the greatest, most interesting cities in the country.
For people who have never been there, what's the appeal in Pittsburgh?
It's beautiful. It's topographically beautiful. It's like San Francisco. It's hilly, and two great rivers combining to form the Ohio. The wealth of cultural amenities, wonderful symphony orchestra, terrific art museum, terrific natural history museum, great libraries, The mother church of all Carnegie libraries is there. Very friendly people. Wonderful sports town for anybody who loves sports. 3 terrific universities. One of the greatest medical schools, medical facilities in the world. It's now the organ transplant capital of the world. And its history is extremely interesting. I know that's one of the reasons I got interested in history early in life, because there was so much going on around, and my family, my parents, grandparents would talk about things that they had seen, things that they knew about in the olden times, and I was hooked. I was growing up in the midst of the Second World War, and the Pittsburgh of that time was that bleak, sooty, fiery, noisy, exciting city of its old reputation. And the skies would be red at night, pulsing red with the blast furnaces going off.
Where in the city did you live?
I lived in the East End, right in the city. And in school and at home, at the dinner table, conversations at the dinner table. That was back when people had dinner together and talked together. We were all told as youngsters that we're making the steel to make the war equipment to win the battle with the Nazis and the Japanese. That Pittsburgh is exciting, that Pittsburgh is important. And we went out and collected scrap for the war effort. So while people hearkened back to how dirty it was and how full of soot, smoke, and grim, I thought it was great. And I have very happy memories of growing up there. And of course, I never knew anything else but that. I thought that's the way the world was.
Well, I have a couple of your books here, and I want to just get you to talk about them very briefly. This one is from quite a few years ago on the Johnstown flood, a Pennsylvania book. Was this your first book?
My first book came about almost by chance. I was working on some projects for the U.S. Information Agency in Washington. It was during the Kennedy administration, and the agency was then being run by Edward R. Murrow, and I was up in the Library of Congress doing some work, and I just walking by a big table in the old prints and photographs division, and there were a whole set of photographs spread out that had been taken by a Pittsburgh photographer soon after the Johnstown flood. He'd gotten his old glass plate equipment over the mountains and down into the beleaguered city. And I stopped to look at them, and I was so stunned by the violence and the destruction as revealed in those photographs. I thought, I'd heard about it all my life, but I didn't realize it was that bad. It was that horrible. So I took a book out of the library just to read about it, and it was very inadequate. And I saw that the author didn't even know the geography. I at least knew that. And I took another one out, and it was, if anything, less satisfactory. And I thought, why don't you try and write the book about the Johnstown flood that you'd like to read? So that was my first book.
How hard was it to sell it?
Not hard at all. Because there hadn't been a book on the subject. It was the worst disaster in the history of the country up until then. It was just about exactly the same number of people who were killed at the World Trade Center on September 11th. And with a lot of aftermath as to what went wrong, who was to blame, all of that.
I don't know if I have these in the right sequence, but there is this book on the building of the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yes, which again derived both out of the book that preceded it, the Johnstown flood, because John Roebling helped survey the route of the railroads through Johnstown. John Roebling, who designed the Brooklyn Bridge. Excuse me. And the Roeblings, John Roebling, Washington Roebling, the builders of the bridge, were all centered in Saxonville, north of Pittsburgh. That was their own town. And so I'd heard about the Roeblings growing up. And when my wife and I were first married, we lived in Brooklyn, on Brooklyn Heights. And that was the second book. And that, in many ways, was the book that really launched me into a full-time career of writing, because it was after the Johnstown flood, the success of the Johnstown flood, that I felt that it was possible that maybe I could make it on my own as a writer.
So you gave up your day job?
I gave up my day job. Took a lot of courage, and particularly on the part of my wife. If she hadn't been as brave about it, I'm not sure I would have been. We had 5 children. We had bills to pay, and well, it worked.
And this one on the building of the Panama Canal?
Yes, that was a horrendous effort, which almost did me in, because the more I went looking for research material, the more I found. And the research and the writing just seemed to go on and on and on. It took 6 years. But it was what in the publishing business they call my breakaway book. It was a main selection of the Book of the Month Club, and it was a bestseller. And Truman was my first big biography. Mornings on Horseback preceded it, biography in part of Theodore Roosevelt. But this was the most ambitious project I ever took on. In fact, if I had known how much work would be involved in writing that book, I never would have undertaken it. So I'm glad I didn't know. It took 10 years.
Have people, since this book came out, have people come to you with Harry Truman stories that you wish you could do a revised edition?
All the time. And they're almost always wonderful. And they're almost always small, personal stories, little revealing scenes when they met him or when something happened that he was part of.
Then there is this one from a couple of years ago about John Adams. Caused another bit of a splash.
And that was my first venture into the 18th century. And I loved it. I think the happiest years of my writing life have been the years writing this book, John Adams, and my new book, 1776, which is a companion work to John Adams. Because in John Adams, I wrote about the political drama of 1776 that took place in Philadelphia, in Independence Hall. But in 1776, I wanted to write about what else was going on in that crucial turning point year that made possible the ideals and ideas of the Declaration being more than just words on paper.
Right, the Continental Congress doesn't play a real big role in this book.
No,
here.
That's not what that book's about. This book's about the war, the people fighting the war. And I feel very strongly that when we celebrate the 4th of July, when we celebrate 1776, we shouldn't just think of the Declaration of Independence or the Broadway play 1776. That's part of the story, and obviously an immensely important part. But it's not the whole story. This, too, is something we should remember, what those men went through, what they did in the face of such adversity and such overwhelming odds against them.
Now, this book is also about 300 pages, which, as David McCullough books go, is fairly short. Well, why did you decide to confine the book to 1776, and why 300 pages?
I decided to confine it, I wouldn't say confine it, focus it on 1776, because that to me was the darkest time in our history, and we are going through a dark time now, and I have heard people say, or write in editorials and on the television, that particularly right after September 11th, that what we're going through is the darkest, most difficult and dangerous time we've ever been through. That's absolutely not so. What was 1776 was. I also didn't want to write a huge volume. I wanted to write a lean, taut book that expressed eloquence through the action, the deeds of what men did. Actions very often speak louder than words. And it isn't a full-scale life and times, which a biography is. I'd also been writing biography for 20 years with the books on Roosevelt, Truman, and John Adams. And I wanted to go back to writing history because it's a different form. It's a different problem and a different opportunity. Here you don't have to just stick with one character all the way through. Some people said, oh, is it a biography of Washington? No, not at all. It's about a lot of people. A lot of people you never heard of. And in many ways, they were the ones I wanted to write about most of all.
Now, in writing so much about Harry Truman and Theodore Roosevelt and John Adams and now George Washington, have you figured out what leadership is?
Sure, in part. You can't predict it. You can't read a resume and see, well, there it is. And it comes in all shapes and sizes. And it often doesn't emerge until there's a call for it. The times give rise to greatness. Surprising performances from people you wouldn't expect. Harry Truman. Who would have ever expected that Harry Truman would turn out to be one of the most important presidents in our history? If you looked at a resume of all the presidents, let's say, you would have to conclude that Herbert Hoover was about as impressive a man as we ever elected. He had a distinguished career and had shown himself to be a superb leader again and again. But when he became president, he was the wrong kind of man for the times. And that's been true of many presidents. Now, it's sometimes said by historians and biographers that all of our great presidents, our great leaders, have been those who were president in times of crisis, which is largely true. But there's at least one very obvious exception to the rule, and that was Theodore Roosevelt. There was no national crisis during his presidency, none whatever. Some thought maybe he was the crisis, but he was just a dynamo of ideas and energy and purpose. The only reason to have power, he said, is to get things done. And the country was in a kind of stage in its development at that point where that's exactly what was needed. It was exactly the spirit of the times. All the horrors and the pessimistic conclusions that would give rise come to the fore after World War I. That was all over the horizon, still to come. Very progress, optimism, that was the creed of the day. Franklin Roosevelt, sort of a dilettante before he became president, not a very impressive governor, not a very impressive fellow, who was in a wheelchair. But he led us through of the two of the worst crises of the century, of the 20th century, the Depression and the Second World War. Magnificent leader with a magnificent capacity to use the language to inspire people.
Is there, now you are rightly or wrongly credited with helping the stars of John Adams and Harry Truman rise in their perception as historical figures. Are there other presidents who deserve that kind of treatment, whose stars should be higher up the horizon than they are?
Well, I say yes, there are other Americans who became president who deserve to be better known, not because they were necessarily a great president. John Quincy Adams comes right to mind.
Really?
One of the most remarkable Americans ever. I think if you could give all the presidents an IQ test, he would probably come in first, even ahead of his father. I think that Gerald Ford is a much more important figure than we realize. Gerald Ford's presidency was extremely eventful presidency, and though I was appalled at the time when he pardoned Nixon, in retrospect, I now feel he did a very brave and politically for him disadvantageous act in pardoning Nixon. I think it was a true profile in courage, and he's an intelligent man. He's got balance. He's rock solid, good middle American, and deserves more credit than he has.
You describe in your book, you describe George Washington, and you talk about him as being a commanding presence, 6 feet 2 inches tall, weighing perhaps 190 pounds. His hair was reddish-brown. The face was largely unlined, but freckled and sun-beaten and slightly scarred by smallpox. A few defective teeth were apparent when he smiled. The surprise there is that Washington's smiling.
We shouldn't think of Washington as a grim man. He did smile. And particularly in moments of relaxation with his officers, sitting around a table after dinner, cracking nuts, drinking wine. He liked a good story. He liked a good joke. He was not an arrogant or severe man. He did not believe that officers should be too friendly with men in the ranks. He told there should be a distance, but when he was with his officers, he could be a very genial fellow.
If you could talk to him, what would you ask him?
Why Martha Washington destroyed all their letters. She destroyed every letter he wrote to her, except a couple of which she stuffed into a book and forgot where they were. They've survived. And she destroyed the letters she wrote to him. I'd like to know why she did that.
You have another book in the works?
Not yet.
This is the book we've been talking about, 1776, and we've been talking to his author, David McCullough. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.